Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, July 22nd, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about 538's Senate forecast over the past three elections beyond 2022, going back to the 2020 Senate election forecast, 2018 Senate election forecast, and of course, the 2016 Senate forecast that has the exact same map as the one that we are looking at in today's November elections. Now, the reason why I want to do this is because we have been relying a lot on the 538 forecast to get a general understanding about how the race is changing day after day. And while we can't entirely put all of our faith into a forecast that sometimes can be accurate, sometimes not be, generally speaking, I do tend to trust 538, but you can't say that every single resource is always going to be 100% accurate, 538 included. Now, I do tend to look at this with a good amount of understanding simply because I'm always looking at the forecast, but I wanted to go a little bit back and reflect on the accuracy of some of these Senate election forecasts to see exactly what we should be expecting and where 538 maybe have missed some marks in previous elections where we might be able to expect different things this time around or maybe go against what their forecast is currently predicting for the upcoming November elections. So we'll start off with 2020, we'll go back to 2018, and then we'll head into 2016, which again I said in the beginning is the exact same map that we're looking at now. We're going to compare it to the actual results and compare it to what we see right now and really just try to find if there's anything that we really should be taking a look at and really cautioning ourselves as we look at this forecast in one of very few resources we have for the upcoming midterms, considering that there are very few forecasts out there. Now, last night I made a video talking about Decision Desk HQ's forecast for 2022. It's very similar to 538 in the regard that they do show a very split result. Republicans and Democrats have about an equal chance at winning control of the U.S. Senate. Right now, I would say that it is getting closer on 538 for the Democratic Party. Yesterday's video had the Republicans in the advantage, and now it's a tie, meaning that in two different scenarios, Democrats do retain the majority. On the other hand, Republicans are able to grab it pretty easily with a 50% chance. I'd really just go ahead and take a look at this, take it all in, and understand what we see wrong and right with previous forecasts as we understand our current 2022 one. So, looking at the 2020 forecast, the Democratic Party was absolutely favored to win control of the U.S. Senate. They ran 40,000 simulations, and they found that in the majority of them, the Democratic Party did win, giving the Democrats about a 75% chance at control in the U.S. Senate. Now, 75% is pretty good, and honestly speaking, it's about where I currently had, or at least I used to have, the Democratic Party for their ability to win in the states in the 2020 Senate elections. Now, there were many close races in 2020. Many of them were coming down to the wire on election night, and some of them were expected to be closer than they actually were. For instance, Kansas or South Carolina. But generally speaking, we had a good amount of competitive states, certainly more than we had in 2022, and this 2020 Senate forecast absolutely indicated that. Now, in many of the states that were called at poll closing for their respective parties, Democrats or the Republicans, they were accurately predicted by 538. And that's something that we should have expected and did expect going into this election. Looking at some of these states, though, again, there were some expected to be more competitive than they actually were. For instance, the state of Montana was expected to be within 3 points. It was decided by about 10 percentage points in that state. The overall winner of the state, the same. Steve Daines did win re-election in the state, but the margin and the closeness of the election was not nearly as much as it actually was when all the votes were counted. Moving over to the state of South Carolina, the margin here was expected to be around 5 points. That margin expanded to double digits for Lindsey Graham, defeated Jamie Harrison by about 10 points across the state. A very similar story to the state of Montana, a race expected to be closer that did not end up being as close as previously predicted. The state of Kansas, the margin was supposed to be about 5 points. This margin ended up being about 11 points in favor of the GOP. So what you found here was that there was some underestimations for the GOP in some cases by 7 points, 5 points, which is pretty substantial when races have really come down to the wire in this election, and a 5.7 point margin off from what the forecasted vote share is could honestly be such a significant deal and could truly determine balance of power just based off of some of these differences and changes based off the accuracy. Now, that's not to say that the map itself wasn't entirely off. That was to say that there were some accurate predictions. For instance, in Colorado, the margin here was very similar to what we actually saw between Hickenlooper and Gardner. You head over to the state of New Mexico, it actually ended up being closer than what was decided here, so a little bit of a miss for 538, but generally speaking, they got the winners correctly. They were right in Montana, right in Kansas, right in South Carolina, right in Colorado, right in New Mexico. They were also correct in Arizona. Now, they were off by the margin by about 2 points I honestly wouldn't really say this is something that I could really blame them for. Arizona was expected to be more of a Democratic state than it actually was, and honestly speaking, they were only off by about 2 percentage points. So it's nothing super out of the ordinary or something that I would say is definitely going to be an alarming thing. On top of that, I'd point back at 2018 Senate forecast, which we can take a look at in just a moment. But as we're looking through some of these states, Iowa and other states were again, expected to be closer than they actually were. It was expected to be within about 2 points in Iowa, ended up being about 6. Generally, a very big underestimation for the GOP when it came down to the national level, but they did end up being correct about who was going to win and who was the victor in many of these states. It was really just the margins that were sometimes off. Now, there were two main misses in the prediction here. One was in the state of Maine, where Sarah Gideon had the higher chance at victory than Susan Collins, according to this forecast. Sarah Gideon ended up losing by about 8 points across the state. Now, one could argue that's because ranked choice voting never went through, but by the end of it, you were typically about to see Susan Collins win by about 6 points, 5 points across the state. By anything, it was an incorrect prediction, and Sarah Gideon did not end up winning the Senate election. Susan Collins was reelected by the voters in the state of Maine. Heading over to the next state of North Carolina, Cal Cunningham had about a 68% chance at winning. He actually lost this race. When you take a look at the margin here, it wasn't extremely impressive. You're talking less than a percentage point here between Cal Cunningham and Tom Tillis. Tom Tillis won by 0.8. Nothing that I would say is solid, but when you were expecting Cal Cunningham to win by about 3.2, that's the problem when you get to a result that shows the opposing party ahead by just under a point. So you're off by about 4 percentage points, and it definitely had a lot to do with the last-minute scandal that broke for Cal Cunningham, but that should have been predicted and calculated into the model because it happened a few weeks before the general election. Moving over to the state of Georgia, they were correct in their victor for the Georgia special election, but in the regular election, they actually predicted that David Perdue was going to defeat Jon Ossoff. Now, it got a little bit tricky because this was expected to go to a runoff, so we probably could have seen a different characterization by the runoff date, but as it stood on the day of the 2020 election, David Perdue had about a 57% chance of winning, Jon Ossoff 43%, but both of them are very high chances for their respective parties, so you can't really knock anyone else. One final state that I want to point out that was off in terms of the margin was the state of Michigan. It was decided by less than 2 points. The margin expected here was about 7, so it was off by about 5 points, but at the end of the day, it was correct in the victor, and that's what you really can celebrate. So, in terms of what was right and wrong, an overestimation for the GOP in the state of Georgia, and underestimation in North Carolina and Maine, and practically all the other states were correct, despite having some margins that were a bit off from what we actually saw on Election Day. And I'd say that's just something to point out. There are some states where the Republican Party does better, some states where the Democratic Party does better. Generally speaking, 538 overestimated the Democratic Party's vote share. But let's go ahead and take a look at past elections to see if they've done something similar or maybe something a little bit different. So we're heading back to 2018, and this was an election in which the Democratic Party was defending 10 Trump states, meaning they had Democratic incumbents in 10 states that went to President Trump in the 2016 presidential election. So if we were to apply the 2016 election results to the 2018 Senate elections, the Republican Party would actually have over 60 seats, meaning a filibuster-proof majority, but that obviously didn't happen. And that didn't happen because the Democratic Party fought for a number of their seats, but 538 had always expected the GOP to keep control of the U.S. Senate, giving Republicans about an 82% chance at doing so. Because the Senate map was so unfavorable for the Democratic Party, it was unrealistic that the Democratic Party was going to win it according to 538. And you can see that the average gain for the GOP was anywhere from 1 seat to 3 seats, and the Republican Party ended up picking up 2. Now, when you look at some of these Senate seats here, you would be surprised to find that, for instance, in Ohio, Sherrod Brown, the Democrat, had a 98% chance at winning. In the state of West Virginia, Joe Manchin had a 87% chance at winning in that state. Head over to Pennsylvania. Bob Casey had a 99% chance at winning. These are all states that went to President Trump in 2016 that 538 predicted the Democratic Party would win, and they did. Same thing in the state of Michigan. It was an absolute certainty the Democratic Party was going to win there. You head over to Wisconsin, same exact thing. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that they were correct also in some of these closer races. For instance, in North Dakota, they said that the margin here was going to be about 5 points. That was very similar to what actually ended up happening. You take a look here, the margin was about 10 points, but they were correct in their estimation. You head over to the state of Missouri. Josh Hawley defeated Claire McCaskill by about 6 points. The 538 forecast had it very narrow. They thought the margin would be less than a point. That did not end up being true. Again, an underestimation of the GOP, but I will say that some of these races were a little bit more accurate than other forecasts. Looking at Indiana, though, this is where they really seem to be a little bit off. Joe Donnelly had a 62% chance of winning. He's a Democrat, expected to win by 2 points. That did not end up happening in the state of Indiana. Mike Braun defeated Joe Donnelly by about 6 points. Now, keep in mind, North Dakota, Missouri, Indiana. North Dakota went to Trump by over 20, Missouri and Indiana by over 15. So for Democrats to even come this close is quite impressive. But at the end of the day, it was not a Democratic retain in the state of Indiana. Democrats lost in North Dakota and Missouri as predicted, but the margins were expected to be closer than they actually were. In the state of Tennessee, you thought this race was going to be closer, according to 538. That simply was not the case. Marsha Blackburn did defeat Phil Bredesen. It was only a close race because Phil Bredesen was a former governor of the state, very popular, but did not end up being super competitive, about 11 points. That's good for the state of Tennessee for the Democratic Party, but realistically, not so much. In Montana, they were right about the victor. Jon Tester did end up winning, as they were in West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota in both of those elections. So looking at that, I would say that the Democratic Party was right to assume they would win some of these states according to the 538 forecast, but 538 was wrong in Indiana, and they were also wrong in the state of Florida. Now, Bill Nelson and Rick Scott were in a very close race, and by the final margin, honestly speaking, it could have gone either way. You take a look at the difference here, 0.2%. Now, Bill Nelson lost to Rick Scott being the incumbent governor at that point in time. It was a very close race. It came down to 10,000 votes out of 8 million cast, so every single vote really mattered in that state. Democrats could have won it, but Republicans also might have been able to expand the majority had they known how close it was going to be. Regardless, though, 538 said that the state of Florida was going to go blue, and it did not end up going blue. However, the Democratic Party was not so confident about their ability to win in some of these other states. But 538 said that they were going to pick up the state of Arizona and pick up the state of Nevada. Now, they were right in Nevada. Jackie Rosen defeated Dean Heller by an expected margin of 2 points, but actually did better than that. When you take a look at the election results in 2018, you found that Jackie Rosen won by about 5 points statewide. This only expected her to win by about 2. You take a look at the Arizona Senate race there, and it was expected to be around a very similar margin to what it was, 2.5%, and guess what it actually was? 2.4%. Kirsten Sinema defeated Martha McSally by a very similar result to what was actually predicted by 538. So just something to think about, just very interesting to see that Arizona and Nevada were very accurate. And they were also accurate again in 2020. The state of Arizona was, and 2016 as well, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So generally what I get from the 2018 map is that the Democratic Party was also overestimated in some of these states, but Republicans were also overestimated in some others. On a broad sense, on a general sense, Republicans were underestimated by 538's map, as they were in 2020, but the general victors, and many of these states can be predicted the same way, the general victors in terms of predictions from 538 were accurate, with exceptions in Indiana and Florida, but beyond that, you didn't really see much else of a difference there. And even if Democrats were to win Indiana and Florida, the Republican Party would still have retained control of the U.S. Senate, which is likely what fueled this 82% chance that the GOP had. But I will say that it is a bit alarming that they did underestimate Republican support, but also did overestimate it in some few areas, which might be important looking at the 22 map, for instance, in Nevada and Arizona. Now, heading back to the 2016 forecast, this one actually predicted the Democratic Party would win control, gave them about a 51% chance at winning, Republicans 49%. At the end of the map, Republicans ended up retaining control of the Senate 52-48. Now, I give 2016 a bit of a pass, and the reason why I say that is because really looking at it on the presidential level, the House level, and the Senate level, it was very difficult to forecast that the Democratic Party was going to lose looking at the polls, looking at the numbers. At least in 2018 and 2020, there was this understanding that the polls aren't always accurate, that 2016 was an embarrassment for many polling firms and polling industries. However, I will say that we still need to recognize what this forecast had said and where it was wrong, where it was right, and how this can help us forecast 2022. So right now, the Democratic Party, 51-49, according to the 2016 forecast. And honestly speaking, this wasn't too far off from what the actual results were. For instance, in Missouri, Jason Kander had a very realistic chance at winning there. I know that's surprising to say, but this Senate race was extremely competitive. Indiana was a bit more competitive. Todd Young only defeated Evan Bayh by about 10 points. The presidential margin, 19 points for Trump over Clinton. So definitely a significant narrowing down. North Carolina was a bit more competitive. Florida went to Rubio. What you found was that practically every state here was correct except for two, the states of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Beyond that, you actually didn't see much wrong. New Hampshire was nearly accurately predicted, especially with these margins. It was the narrowest Senate race in the entire country, and that's exactly what the prediction entailed. Looking at the state of Nevada, they were right to assume Cortez Masto was going to defeat Joe Heck. Looking at the race, it did come down to 2.4%, but it was still a victory for the Democratic Party, and one that was likely predicted by what we saw in this map. In fact, underestimated Democratic support in the state of Nevada. Something to think about when you look at the state of Nevada in 2022. I didn't know why I clicked over to Arizona because that was not competitive back then. Heading over to the state of New Hampshire, they were right in their margin, actually saying Maggie Hassan was going to win by 0.3. She won by 0.1, very, very close to the actual result. So that margin in that predicted forecast there, extremely right. But the two main parts that were wrong were Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Now, the thing about Pennsylvania is that Kate McGinty and Pat Toomey were neck and neck for a good portion of the race, but Pat Toomey had a very good shot at victory in July of 2016, so a very similar time frame to now. The GOP was soaring high. Then Katie McGinty started to expand her lead over Pat Toomey. Now, the problem was that these polls were unable to gauge the true amount of Republican support because of President Trump's name. It was the Trump polling effect that was very apparent, and we found it to be true down ballot, especially in states such as Pennsylvania, where McGinty had a 62% chance of victory. Now, honestly speaking, Pat Toomey being at 38% isn't bad. That's a very good shot at winning, and in any type of normal forecast, it's very possible that it happens. 38% doesn't mean anywhere near impossible at winning the race. It just means a slightly better environment for you puts you over the top, and that's exactly what happened in the state of Pennsylvania. But where 538 really missed the mark was in the state of Wisconsin. Now, arguably, it got a lot closer before the election. It went from a 95% chance for Russ Feingold down to 82, so it dropped by a significant amount right before the election. But Feingold ended up losing by 3.4%. And that's because the polls went from being larger Feingold leads to starting to get a little bit closer. But by the end of it, it was an expected state for the Democratic Party to win. What we found here is that this chance at winning control was combined with the Democratic Party's expectations that they do win the presidency, because this would in fact have been a 50-50 map. It ended up being 52-48, but what we found was that the 538 forecast was actually spot on, with the exception of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Now, looking at 2018, there actually weren't that many inaccuracies as well. It was wrong in Indiana and the state of Florida, but beyond that, you didn't really see much else. You head over to 2020, they were wrong in the state of Georgia, they were wrong in the state of Maine and North Carolina, but those are three states that were inaccurate. So 538 isn't always right, as no one has ever expected it to be, sometimes off by 2 to 3 states. The reason why this is so important as we look to 2022 and caution ourselves looking at the forecast is because there isn't any leeway for either political party. Should Democrats win one more seat, they're at 51-49, they no longer need Vice President Harris. Should the GOP win just one singular seat, they win the majority. So imagine if 538's map is off by 2 to 3 seats. The good news for both parties is that this forecast is easier to predict than 2020, 2018, and 2016, because there are more competitive races in those elections than there are in this one. Looking at the states that are competitive, what do you have? Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, New Hampshire, and maybe some people would argue the state of Ohio. Beyond that, you really don't see much else as these truly competitive races. And that's why it would become easier to predict because of the fact that these races are so narrow in scope, and are, most of them, easily predictable. What we have found in terms of general trends, Democrats are underestimated in the state of Nevada. That's been very consistent over the forecast. In addition to that, it seems to be a bit spot on in some of these states, typically in the states of Arizona, also Nevada, sometimes New Hampshire. That one seemed to be very accurate in 2020 and in 2016, so we can probably trust it this time around, but there also were some heavy inaccuracies. Most of them in red states: Indiana, Missouri, Montana, North Dakota, but those are states that are not competitive or even up in some cases for this upcoming election. So I definitely say look at Wisconsin and say, historically speaking, it was right in 2018, wrong in 2016. We don't know what to expect. Pennsylvania was right in 2018, wrong in 2016. We don't know what to expect, but we can pretty much take this into consideration, see what was right and wrong, whether it coincided with a presidential year or a midterm year, and really adjust what our understanding is of the Senate elections based off of 538. On a broader sense, 538 tends to overestimate the Democratic Party's chances. I think currently speaking, they slightly underestimate them, but that's only because I think that this forecast is different than the ones we've seen in the past. I'm not trying to fall into this trap of blindly trusting a forecast or blindly trusting the polls. I say all the time that both Democrats and Republicans have a very good shot at winning control of the U.S. Senate. Right now, I think the Democratic Party has the narrow upper hand just because they've really lucked out with some of these candidates. I think the GOP has fielded the worst slate of candidates I have seen in my experience with American politics. But of course, you look back at 2012 where I wasn't active. I was, not even 10 years old then. But looking at the 2012 election, I would say that rivals the slate of candidates that we see this time around. Looking at the 2022 Republican nominees for U.S. Senate, I can't say I'm thoroughly impressed, but also it doesn't take much in order to win in a wave year, and I think we will find that to be true this upcoming November. So keep this all in mind when you look at the 538 forecast. Remember what we have learned thus far looking at 2020, 2018, 2016. Sometimes the forecast is right, sometimes it's not, and it's very difficult to predict, but we have to take that, understand that this is a risk that we take with trusting this forecast. It's a risk that we take understanding it entirely. And right now, it's about even odds for the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, which makes a lot of sense if you ask me. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.